I think we'll go ahead and get started. Others may drift in, but I like to start and begin end on time. What we're doing today is really a fairly new pursuit for me, and it may also be for you. I'm calling our discussion today gospel geography, gospel geography, and the Gospels of Thomas and Mary Magdalene. I've given you a map. It's a small map of the Mediterranean world. Um, and uh, what I want to point out is that you well know this is it's the Mediterranean Sea. The big water there is the Mediterranean Sea. Uh, you find the Italian boot, and Rome is right up there in the Italian boot. At that particular time, as you know, Rome ruled the world, or much of the world. The Roman Empire, embraced much of that vast area around the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, much more than that, up into Britain, and it was rapidly expanding. Okay, the Jesus movement began in a teeny little portion of that Roman Empire. Um, if you can you look at the map, it's it's this little tiny piece here. Uh, that is what that is today is largely the country of Israel. Uh, in Roman times, it was the province of Palestine, Judea. It went back and forth between the name from Palestine and Judea. Uh, and it was ruled by Rome. Rome in the 60s, BCE, Rome had taken over. They were rapidly running the world. Okay, the Jesus thing that we live out of today began in a little bitty part of that little bitty world there in Galilee. You often think it began in Jerusalem, but it really began up in Galilee. And I'm guessing that Galilee uh, may have been the size of Hall County. I mean, or maybe Hall and part of Gwinnett. At any rate, in the grand scope of the Roman world, it was only a teeny part of that. So when you get home and pull up a big map, you can see right on the end of the Mediterranean Sea is the country with the Roman province of Judea, Palestine. In ancient days, Israel and Philistines and all of that was there. But that's where it started. Uh, and it started with this man, Jesus. Uh, we are steadily finding out more about the man, Jesus. Uh, for a long time, the scholars said you could not really know anything about Jesus of Nazareth. We could talk about that sometime. In the last 50, 60, 75 years, a great deal of very important study has taken place among a whole breadth of scholars to try to get a fix on Jesus of Nazareth, on the man Jesus. Because the man Jesus, not the Christ, but the man Jesus, started in ways that we can imagine and figure out. This one man started this whole thing, uh, which is quite astounding. He was the Matthew and Luke birth stories have him born in Bethlehem. We we're going to talk about that around Christmas. I'm going to do uh, a study on the two narratives, birth narratives in Matthew and Luke at that point. Uh, but they say he was born in Bethlehem. He might have been, but he grew up in Nazareth. And Nazareth was a little bitty town. I don't know what would be comparable to, but little bitty town up in Galilee. You got Jerusalem, Samaria, and Galilee, kind of up and down that corridor there. Uh, Galilee apparently was a very fertile part of the world. Uh, they were able to have a lot of agriculture. It was also a time of great tumult. The Romans had taken over. Um, they had sent vast armies in there to control the country like they did all over the world. A Roman soldier was conscripted if he enlisted or was conscripted typically for 20 years. And what they had begun to do by the time of Jesus, when the Roman soldier retired, wherever he might be when he retired, he could stay there. Uh, and the Roman government, the emperor, made provision for his family. Maybe they still lived in Italy, in Rome, city of Rome. They made provisions for the family of XYZ soldier to move to wherever he might quit, wherever he might muster out of the army. The downside of all of that is that wherever he mustered out, the Roman government, the Roman army, simply gave him a farm. Now, the farm might have belonged to Rita's family for 300 years, but XYZ soldier retired there, and so they gave it to him. And Rita and her family could scream and holler and protest and everything they wanted to. This is our land. We can't do that. If you boot us off of this, we'll starve to death. And the Roman army said, tough, tough. They gave it to him. So there was a lot of tumult, a lot of confusion at that particular time. I mean, always. Jesus, from all appearances and the four Gospels, went to the small villages in Galilee. He was not a city preacher. Paul became the city preacher. Jesus was the small town preacher. He obviously had great ability to communicate. He was a man of deep religious faith, steeply rooted into the Jewish tradition. He had some kind of capacity, apparently, of medical or healing or something like that. We don't know exactly how long his ministry lasted, 5 years, 3 years, some even say a few months. I, I sort of go with the normal thing of 3 years. In those 3 years, he dotted through these little bitty towns of Galilee. Uh, maybe according to the gospel stories, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he went to Jerusalem maybe once or twice in his whole life. In the Gospel of John, he goes more often, but in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he goes very seldom. Uh, I think it is in Luke. He was when he was 12. He went to Passover, and then he goes back when he's 30, according to the way Luke tells the story. And that's when he went back and he got in trouble and died in at that particular time. The point I'm trying to make is Jesus spent his time in the little bitty villages of Galilee. Uh, we don't know, we have snippets of that in the Gospels, but we don't know any kind of depth of that, except if the Gospel accounts are consistent, anywhere near relevant. Jesus spent his time in the small Galilean villages. I am persuaded that he made such an impact on the people of those little bitty villages that even when the word got out that he had been crucified, the people said, well, he may be dead, but he's not gone. He had made such an impact on them with his care and love and teaching and healing and all of the stuff like that, that there was an increasing milieu, increasing idea that this Jesus of Galilee who had been crucified was a unique long promised Messiah, Son of God. Now, what all of that was is much interesting debate about what all of that was. But that is what emerged there. That at a point in time, he began to be acknowledged as the Christ. We were talking a minute ago before we started. I was well along in my life before it dawned on me that Christ was not his last name. He was Jesus, son of Joseph, Jesus of Nazareth. After the Easter event, the death, resurrection, and the people began to acknowledge him as the Son of God, unique Son of God, he was gifted with the name Christ, which means Messiah. We know now from I don't know I studied Hebrew and Greek, you know that, but I don't do it anymore. But Christ is a translation, a Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah or leader. David, King David, earned the title Messiah, Meshach, Messiah. Uh, Doug over there may still know enough Hebrew to do all that stuff. I don't. So Christ was a title of honor, a title of recognition. It was not his last name. To talk about the day Christ died is really a misnomer. We need to say the day Jesus died and he became the Christ. I like to think of the pre-Easter Jesus and the post-Easter Christ. That a couple of my favorite scholars quarrel with that idea, but that's a handy one. So the point of there, the geography, the initial geography of the whole Jesus movement was a area small. I have no idea how it would compare to Hall County, but it was not very big. It was small. And that makes all the more the uniqueness and charm and power of the whole Jesus movement that emerged out of that. So we're generally familiar then with that little piece of geography where Jesus got started. If you expand to the whole country, it's still not very big. Even Israel today, the main part of Israel, is not very big. It is what has happened in that little patch of ground there for about 2,500, 3,000 years is all out of proportion to its size. You can understand the Roman Empire, all the big empires, but this little bitty piece of ground over there, so much has happened to shape the world for the last many, many centuries. It's amazing. So the first piece of geography to think about is that little piece of Galilee. Okay. The next piece of the geography that I want to point out is the geography that's on down the line there, the geography of what we in seminary called the missionary journeys of Paul. Uh, I wish it were bigger, but uh, so you got Galilee, and you got Israel, Palestine, Judea right there, and then Paul along the way felt persuaded by God and by the Spirit that he needed to go preach to the non-Jews, another whole world of that. And Paul spent his time of some unknown years, but maybe 20, 25 years, in this area here that is considered the West. Uh, we are living in the Western Hemisphere. We live in stuff. The whole world, what it's now Europe and Rome and all that kind of stuff, is considered the West. And so Paul he preached in the major cities of the West. From He probably started preaching in Jerusalem, but he went to Damascus. But then he went out into what now is Turkey. The major part of Paul's work as a missionary preacher what was in the country, it was in the region. They called it Asia Minor. It is today basically the country of Turkey, but it's also the country of Macedonia and it's also the country of Greece. And Paul apparently concluded his ministry and really his life in Rome. So a comparatively small section of the Roman Empire. I mean, Paul walked thousands of miles. He didn't ride a donkey. He didn't have a golf cart. He didn't have an SUV. He walked all of that. He walked and walked, and occasionally would take a boat. He would sail in the outer reaches there of the Mediterranean Sea. Paul's message to the western part of the Roman Empire was the message, the theology of the cross. So when you think about Paul's geography, he's going around the edge of the Mediterranean Sea from Jerusalem up through here, finally winding up in Rome. So you got an arc there when Paul went. And his message was a theology of the cross. He preached, and particularly in Corinth, we have that in the gospel. I mean, in the letters, he said, "I came to preach Christ and Him crucified." So Paul preached a theology of the cross, and you and I have grown up for the last 2,000 years under the ethos of the theology of the cross. Perfectly legitimate, perfect understanding of what they came to understand about Jesus. One of the earliest debates that occurred in that era was, what is the meaning of the death of Jesus? What is the meaning of the death of Jesus? Why did Jesus die? The thousands of doctoral dissertations have probably been written on that theme. Why did Jesus die? Did God kill Jesus? Really sticky wicky questions in there that can cause us to think a lot. What is the meaning of the death of Jesus? Paul said the meaning of the death of Jesus is that it was a way for us human beings to be reconciled to God. It's the theology of the atonement, all kinds of interesting stuff in there. Uh, when I was in seminary in the 60s, we had a wonderful professor of systematic theology, Dr. Boyd Hunt, really a fine man, very bright scholar. And as a part of systematic theology, we had, for a test, we had to memorize the 7 theories of the atonement. Why did Jesus die? Theologians across the centuries have sort of isolated what Dr. Hunt used to say, 7 theories of the atonement. Then he gave us a test to list and explain the 7 theories of the atonement. And then when it was all over, he said, now you have memorized all of those 7 theories of the atonement, but none of them really fully work. So there. Why did Jesus die? That's a big part of the meaning there that we still deal with. Why? What is the theology of that? Most of us quickly say Jesus died for the sins of the world. Well, that is a big way to say that. When you begin to poke around in that assertion, there are a lot of issues that arise there, even that are interesting to deal with. So Paul, in that western curve around the Mediterranean, preached 15, 20 years. We talked last week about the undisputed letters of Paul. Paul wrote at least 7 letters, and probably much more than that, to these Jesus groups that were forming, either that he was forming or that in ways that we can only speculate were forming. We really don't know how a lot of those little Jesus groups were formed. We do know that they were formed. That's another whole fascinating story. There's terrific book. Maybe sometime we could look at. I mentioned it before. Uh, from Jesus to Christianity. From Jesus to Christianity. And the point of that book is that you really can't call what emerged from all of that Christianity until into the second century. It just was still too amorphous. Anyway, that's another whole pursuit. But anyway, so that whole thing there. So you kind of get that? Paul preached in this curve here around there. Why did he do that? Well, they had good roads. Roman army had built a great network of roads that would enable the army to move quickly if trouble arose. That was the rationale that Eisenhower gave for building the American interstate system. It was built as a military device. The whole interstate system. Uh, President Eisenhower gave the rationale for that, and that's an oversimplification. That the interstate system was a defense mechanism. Well, Rome built those roads, some of which are still visible, I'm told. Uh, and it was a time of relative peace. Caesar Augustus had come along in what, 14 BCE and became the first Roman emperor, another fascinating story. And he instituted what history has called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which he did. He did it through military power. Uh, Dominic Crossan talks about peace as a matter of justice or peace as a matter of military conquest. And Caesar Augustus created the Pax Romana that was still in a pretty good effect in Paul's time because of an incredible military operation throughout the whole Roman world. But Paul was able to do that with relative safety to go all through their preaching. You read the book of Acts and all kinds of we know all kind of conflict was going on there. But anyway, another in every one of these, there are a dozen more stories. So Paul preached successfully, no doubt, successfully in that ark. And what we have only recently, really in the last 50, 60 years, began to understand with any kind of sophistication that what the Western part where Paul preached, where the churches took hold, was only a small part, or not, was only a part of the growth of the Jesus movement. So Paul preached in the West, but there was another whole movement that was being created parallel to what Paul was doing in the West. Very vibrant, very vital. Now you look at the map, and all across what would be this coast of the Mediterranean Sea, all across through there, for the first 500 years of what became Christianity, it was very, very, very vital, vibrant, very multi-layered, but a really, really, really vital expression of Christianity. The same thing was happening in the West. You get the idea if you read the book of Acts that everything was lovey-dovey, that everybody was getting along and they were selling all their property and everybody was giving it to one another. And no, that was not the way that it was at all. To read Paul's letters, you know how conflicted those Jesus groups were. Uh, and the same thing was happening in in what we call Eastern Christianity in that same time. Uh, Now, the issue was because what Paul had done in this outer curve of the Mediterranean Sea had taken hold, and because Emperor Constantine and the emerging Bishop of Rome, who became the Pope, a lot of dynamics in there. That western part where Paul preached, all that curve there, gain not only theological power, but gain political, economic, and military power. And so the leaders of that Western curve there of what was becoming the church, what was becoming the Roman Catholic Church, they had the power to say that only what they agreed to was real Christianity. Okay? So the theology of the cross that Paul preached became orthodox. That became standard. So, in complete disregard for what was happening all in the eastern part of the world down there, uh, the Catholic bishop said everything down there is heretical. Everything down there is anti-Christian. And they had the power, the multiplied levels of power to enforce that. And so the the very earnest Jesus people who lived in this eastern region of the Roman world, all of them were called heretical. It would be uh, if suddenly the the Methodist Church of Georgia gained full power, and the bishop of the Georgia Conference of Methodists could say everything that Doug believes about the Episcopal Church is wrong. Everything that Rita believes about the Presbyterian Church is wrong. It is heretical. It is not Christian. Doesn't matter that Doug really has a heart for Jesus. Doesn't matter that Rita really has a heart for Jesus. The Methodist bishop says, no way. And he could, if he had the power of the government behind him, then he could make it really difficult for Rita and Doug to maintain their own attitude, their own approach to faith. Okay. So that's what was happening. The bishops of Rome, the bishops of the standard churches of that arc there had the levels of power to declare that if you didn't dot your I and cross your T like they said you should, then you were in outer darkness. You were not saved. You were lost. You were heretical. Okay. So that was the dynamic. Doesn't matter that thousands and thousands and probably hundreds of thousands of really good people down in here uh, were Jesus people. It didn't matter because the bishop of Rome, the bishops of whatever had said, no, you don't count. You don't count. Uh, Now, what was happening down there was a different understanding of the meaning of Jesus. Now, remember, all through where Paul preached, what did Jesus mean? Well, they were battling that day and night, thick and thin. What did Jesus mean? We know about that. We only recently, really, in the last 100 years, finding out what all was happening down through this other part of the Roman world and understanding that though it was different, it was nonetheless real to the people, to the Jesus people in that part of the world. So you've got, and it's a terrible oversimplification, but you've got the theology of the cross in the West that Paul basically preached. And we are, even 2,000 years down the pike, we live under this idea of the theology of the cross of Jesus, crucifixion of Jesus. Jesus died, Easter, everything that we believe. That's what we cling to. That's the way we think. Uh, but all through another part of the world, that Eastern world, as they describe themselves, they were coming to a different understanding of who Jesus was and they were coming to a different understanding of what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. So they were different, but they were nonetheless, in their own way, devoted to Jesus. Now, they had some major differences down in through there, and we're going to look at that in a minute. Uh, that group of people down in that eastern part would readily say that Jesus died. Well, Jesus was crucified. They would also say that Jesus came back, that there was some sense of Easter, some sense of resurrection, visions, or something like that. But they were saying what really mattered was not the death of Jesus. What really mattered was the life of Jesus. It was not what happened to Jesus after he came back after Easter. It was what Jesus did in those villages of Galilee and the kind of human stuff, humanitarian activity that Jesus actually implemented. So again, a huge oversimplification. You got a theology of the cross and you've got a theology of activity. Two main branches there. Uh, Paul preached that you came to an understanding of Jesus through faith, through faith. These Eastern Christians said you came to an understanding of Jesus through your mind. Uh, you came to an understanding, a saving understanding of Jesus through what they called knowledge or gnosis, which takes many, many, many forms. But nevertheless, they were saying that you could come to Jesus. You could. Their language was you could come to full humanity, uh, as you embraced this unique, multi-layered, I mean, very complicated kind of knowledge. But they said it could happen to anybody. Now, the bishops over here in Rome and all did not like what was happening in the East over here, I think, for two main reasons. Mary Magdalene and her whole crowd over there in that eastern part of the world said, you could come to Jesus, you could come to salvation, you could come to full humanity without a priest. The knowledge that was available to you when you open your mind and spirit was all that you needed. You did not need a priest. And by then, a priesthood was developing. Rome, the church, and on and on. Well, there's always been priests. Egypt, ancient Egypt, all of them had priests who sort of controlled religion. Uh, but these Eastern folks were saying you could come to full humanity. You could come to the fullness of the Father, fullness of the Savior through knowledge, not faith, but knowledge. Okay. Um, and the other part that drove the Catholic friends up the wall was women had full status. Women could be priests. Long, long time ago, I read a beautiful little book, When Women Were Priests. Uh, and you read Paul's letter to Romans, the last chapter of the book of Romans. He lists all the women, men and women, but women who helped him with his ministry. And he calls them deacons. They were teachers and leaders and healers and deacons. Paul was good on that. But uh, as it moved on out, as this as the two polarities really began to kind of come into focus, the Roman Catholic group, and that by the 5th century, that was what we had, said women could not do that. only men, and you had to be in the apostolic succession of all of that to have any validity as a leader of the church. Big deal there. Uh, so you have these two pieces. Uh, and then uh, the Roman Empire fell. The barbarians finally took over Rome, wiped out, destroyed, razed the city of Rome, what, 450, 430, 450, somewhere along in there. So the Roman Empire, which had begun in 700 BCE, that they say, lasted about 1,000 years, which is pretty good. Lasted about 1,000 years. They were gone, and that left a vacuum in Western Europe. And the Pope, whoever he might be at the particular time, in effect became the emperor of the West. No king could do anything in that Western world without some involvement with the Pope and with the uh, upper clergy of the Roman Catholic Church. So all of that was happening. Um, and then in the 7th century, they date the rise of the introduction of Islam in 610. In Islam was a very militaristic religion, as you know. And so over the next 100 or so years, what had been Christian Eastern Europe down here, Eastern Mediterranean, what had been Christian became Muslim. Now that's another huge oversimplification, but Egypt and Morocco and all those modern states that we think of, Saudi Arabia, all of that became Muslim. Uh, now always down in there, there've been Christian groups in the country of Ethiopia. I had a friend who was from Ethiopia. A very fervent brand of Christianity has been very much alive in Ethiopia for centuries, forever and ever and ever and ever. So even though it became predominantly Muslim, there were still these Christian groups. Okay, I'm going to take you on another trip now. Okay, uh, we didn't know we. I was in seminary in the '60s. Finished seminary in '63. I began one or two little snippets of what they call Gnosticism, this idea of knowledge. We had a quick little conversation about that. But even my seminary professors, who all of whom were Baptist, said it was heretical, that there was anti-God, anti-Jesus, the whole thing. And what our Eastern cousins did really was heretical, not good. Uh, so that was 1960, 62, 63. Fine. I didn't know any better. Uh, but the world was changing. Very little piece that you want to try to remember here. 1954. I mean 1946. 1946. In probably a little bitty, cruddy Egyptian village called Nag Hammadi. Nag Hammadi. An Egyptian farmer uh, was back at, he was a farmer. You know how they farm. The Nile came and went and everything. And as the Nile came and went, it built up mineral deposits in banks up and down the Nile River. I'm having to read that. I've never been over there. So these banks, you've seen the banks around the river and all. Those banks were very rich in minerals. So apparently what the farmers routinely did is they planted their crops. They would go chop into those walls and use the residue, the stuff that had built up there as fertilizer. It was being what we would call an organic fertilizer. So Joe, or whatever his name was, and they know what his name was, from Nag Hammadi had his axe and he was chopping away at the wall to get the fertilizer to put on his crop. And he broke through the wall, broke through the wall, and inside the cave, and he was a cave. He came into a cave of some size, and in the cave was a large earthenware jar. Some say more than one jar. Anyway, it was a big earthenware jar, and here was this jar that this very superstitious Egyptian farmer had totally accidentally discovered. He was scared to death because he thought a genie might be in the jug. So he backed away. Uh, his mother came along and horribly, and inside the jar, somebody smarter, maybe Doug came along or Stan or somebody said, "Oh, there's no such thing as a genie. Let's see what's in that." And they found all these books and scrolls inside the jar, inside the big jar. The story is that before they found out how valuable that thing was, that this farmer's mother actually used some of that for firewood. She actually burned some of those incredible documents. But what they had found was they had found what they called the Nag Hammadi Library. The Nag Hammadi Library. The jar, the big jar or jars, were full of books. Uh, and this is a translation, this is an English translation of what they found in there. Uh, and what it showed was, among its many dimensions, was how vital the first 500, 600 years of Eastern Christianity really was. It was very, very vital, very complex. Uh, Along the way, uh, the Bishop of Alexandria, they had it all divided out into dioceses. The Bishop of Alexandria, Egypt, declared that all of these books by these groups that they had decided were heretical, they had to burn all of those books because the bishop had said, you don't need to read those. That's the index. The governor of Florida would have come along and thrown them all out. That's the way. But apparently, one of the monasteries, and there were monasteries everywhere, one of the monasteries said to the bishop very quietly, not so fast. And what they apparently did was take their most treasured documents, books, codices, scrolls, all kinds of stuff, and put them in this big jar, sealed it up, and put it in the cave and covered it up. And most people think that that happened in about the fourth century. So from the fourth century until 1946, almost 1,500 years, in this wall, this cave in Egypt, was this treasure of of that showed the diversity of that whole world of Christianity. Now it's unfair to call it Gnostic, but that's just kind of the quick way to do it. It's very difficult reading, a lot of very difficult reading. And they said that one came into a relationship with the good, with God, with the Savior through these experiences of knowledge, and they also infused a lot of that with all kind of mythology, many layers of deity. It's a very complicated sort of thing. And I don't read these documents were originally in Greek, and then along the way, the monks recopied them into Coptic, Coptic, which is still in use in Ethiopia and places like that. But it was a language that of religion, but it was also vernacular. So these many, many books were in Coptic. Uh, so, uh, they found these books. And then over a long period of time, 30, 25, or 30 years, scholars from the whole wide world began to read. No wonder they had to learn Coptic. They had to learn to read Coptic. And they began to read these, and then they began to see how diverse the first 300 years of Christianity really were. What Paul was doing was not all that was happening in the Christian world. He was very vital. You know, we're the product of that. But also that whole lower region down there was just as vital to thousands, to hundreds of thousands, to millions of people who called themselves Christians. The people in the West called themselves Christians. They had a theology of the cross. The people in the other part of the world down there called themselves Christians, and they had a theology of knowledge, of gnosis. Sincere apologies for all of how simple oversimplification that is. There's scores of those documents. Two of them I can read. I mean, I cannot read the Coptic. I can read the translation. Uh, and one of these is called the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas. Uh, and what the Gospel of Thomas says is that Thomas Didymus, who is referenced in the Gospels, particularly in the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, Thomas is the doubting Thomas. You know that one. Jesus appeared after the resurrection. Thomas was not there when he came, and he came back, and the people said Jesus came. And Paul said, Thomas says, "I will not believe unless he comes to me, and I put my fingers in the wound in his hands and all." So then Jesus comes later, and Thomas, beautiful statement, bows and says, "My Lord and my God." So Thomas Didymus is the one who got the message from the Savior, uh, and put what the Savior said. They don't ever call him Jesus. He's the Savior. What the Savior said, Thomas wrote down, recorded, wrote it. Another whole tradition says that Thomas is the twin brother of Jesus. Now, I don't know that we can corroborate that, but that's one of the big traditions, that Thomas means twin. Didymus is twin. And so then they go ahead and say that Thomas Didymus, was the brother with the twin brother of Jesus. Well, we don't know that. Uh, the Gospel of Thomas it's a book. You can buy the book. I've got it here. I mean, one of the pieces in here. The Gospel of Thomas is 114 sayings that are ascribed to Jesus. Very, very, very fascinating and important document. Um, a man named Mark, a British scholar, has just come out with a commentary on the book of Thomas. Brilliant. He's head of the theology, the Bible department, or whatever it is at Duke. So he's a smart guy. And his theory is that a lot of these 114 sayings in the Gospel of Thomas is an independent source that Thomas or somebody, at some point got from Jesus. So they would say these are original sayings of Jesus. Big debate about that. The Gospel of Thomas contains no narrative. The Gospel of Thomas contains no story. He's never called the Messiah. He's never called the Son of God. The Gospel of Thomas is 114 sayings that, if you get inside of those sayings, if you can appropriate them, then you 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 come to what they call full humanity. To get that in your head, he starts out by saying, if you properly interpret what I'm saying, you will never taste death. You will, you know, so metaphorically, I guess, you will never taste death. So 114 sayings. We don't have time to. In your notes, I've given you some of those sayings. A lot of those sayings sound like sayings that we have in the Gospels. Others sound differently. He also tells the Jesus, the Savior, in the Gospel of Thomas, he gives parables. Uh, Jesus was a teacher of parables. When I was in seminary in the 60s, we would read a parable, and then our job was to try to figure its meaning, what Jesus meant with those parables. The better scholarship, the later scholarship says, you read the parable and you find your own meaning in it. Sometimes what Jesus gives the story, and I think it's in Mark, of the parable of the sower, which is also in the Gospel of Thomas. The disciples turned to after Jesus tells that parable, and they said, "What does it mean?" And so Jesus says, "I can't believe you're so dumb that you don't get this story." So he starts a whole rank of scholarship says that Jesus gave the parable with no interpretation. And then Mark later, when he began to write his gospel some 30 or 40 years after Jesus, he inserted that anecdote in there about Jesus explaining the parable. The books that I read insist that you read the parable and you find your own meaning. The great story, the prodigal son, Luke 15, nowhere in the story of the lost coin, the lost sheep, or the lost son is the name God used. Luke does not include the name God. Now we've come along, I think. I've preached prodigal son, and I'm sure Doug and these others have too. You infuse it with your own meaning, but parables are designed, I think, to trigger. What does this mean, and what does this mean to me? Uh, so you're figuring that out for yourself. What does the parable of the sower mean? You know, we've done that a whole lot, but anyway, 114 sayings, and uh, Mark, the guy that heard on the other day, thinks that some of these sayings may actually have been the original words of Jesus. That is a big academic debate, but they're very ancient. The Gospel of Thomas probably was at written from 60, somewhere in 60 to 115 or 20. Very, very ancient writing here. So very important. A lot of the other pieces in the Nag Hammadi library also. So Gospel of Thomas, sayings, no theology, no narrative, nothing, just a series of sayings. The other really favorite gospel of mine is called the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is very prominent in the Gospels. Mary Magdalene, or the way the Gospels tell the story, Jesus went to Magdala on his final journey to Jerusalem. He went through Magdala and met Mary and her family. In my telling of it, I think Mary and Jesus fell in love, but Jesus said, "Look, I'm in a lot of trouble. We can't get married." And Mary said, "Okay." She cried. You know, that's my story. She wept, but she said, "I'm going with you anyway." And we do know that. She said, "I'm going with you." And from then on, until Jesus was killed, Mary was there. But in the Gospels, Mary was with Jesus on that final journey. She was at the arrest. She was at the trial. She was at the crucifixion. She was at the death. And she was at the resurrection. Mary, a woman, was in all of those. No, none of the other Gospels, none of the other disciples were there. but Mary was at all of that, which says that she was very important. Okay. Uh, Mary becomes, I mean, pretty clear from a lot of study, Mary, a woman, becomes an important leader, not the only leader, but an important leader of this whole Eastern expression of the Jesus movement. Uh, Mary says, and you have to read it, what I've given you there. Mary says, what number one, her she has a gospel, and long fascinating story. Other writers from antiquity would mention Mary's gospel, but nobody had a copy of it. Elizabeth is writing to Stan, and Elizabeth is complaining. She heard that this woman Mary down there in the boonies wrote a gospel. It's bound to be heretical, and she's telling Stan that, but nobody has a gospel, until the late 1800s, 1880 or 90 or somewhere in there, in the what they call the antiquities market in Egypt and all. They found uh, three fragments that the scholars quickly said, this is authentic, this is very, very ancient, and a big portion of that, I mean, a good little piece of that, is enough to get a narrative out of it. So there is a narrative here of Mary and her gospel. Mary's gospel is Mary having visions with the risen Savior. Paul had visions. Visions were very credible. If a person of credibility said, I had a vision, then everybody else was inclined to believe it. If Sammy says he had a vision of Jesus and he's talking to Dean over here, Gene would say, okay, fine, that works. Sammy is completely credible. He leads us in exercise. He's a good guy. He had a vision. Fine. I'm going to accept his vision. Mary had visions of the risen Savior. Um, she had them, and then a lot of stuff was happening. Uh, and then Peter says, "Mary, tell us what you saw. Tell us what the Savior told you." And Mary says, "Do you really want to hear?" And Peter says, "Yeah, tell us." Um, so Mary says, "The Savior tells me that you are." She tells him in the fragment that's survived what what the vision entailed, and in the vision, the Savior says, "Go preach this gospel." And in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, uh, Peter and the others say, we don't want to do that. If we go out preaching like Jesus did, look what happened to him. They didn't want to go. They did not, in this telling, they did not want to risk their lives to go preach this new gospel of Jesus. Um, they did. They finally did. So Mary is telling them all of this stuff, and then in the narrative, Andrew, one of the disciples, speaks up and said, "I cannot believe that Jesus talked to a woman. I cannot believe." This is in the fragment there. Why would Jesus give all of this stuff, this strange stuff, to a woman? And Peter, this is all in the narrative. Uh, Peter pipes in and says, "Yeah, what? What is all this stuff with a woman?" And then one of the other disciples named Levi speaks up. And first of all, he said, "Peter, you've always been crotchety." He says, "You've always been a grump. You've always been hard to get along with. And here you are. Here's Mary. She's had this vision. She's sharing with us. She's upset. She's crying because you are questioning her. Why would she make all this stuff up? Peter, you're a grump. Get a hold of it." And then Levi says, of course, the master, the Savior, talked to Mary because Mary was willing to listen. And then one of them, Peter, this, well, I forget which one of them, says, okay, I get it. Jesus loved, first of all, he says, Jesus loved Mary more than any other woman. This is in the gospel. Jesus, the Savior, doesn't say the Savior loved Mary more than any of the rest of us. Uh, and then Levi says the Savior came to Mary in this kind of way because Mary is worthy. Mary is worthy. Uh, and then the narrative, the gospel closes with the group. Then we, by implication, agreeing that the Savior really she really had a vision with of Jesus, of the Savior, and it's completely authentic. And so then the gospel, the disciples go out and begin to preach. That is it in a hurry. Uh, Professor Karen King at Harvard, has written an absolutely marvelous book entitled The Gospel of Mary Magdalene. We could just spend all kind of time with that, and sometime we might do that. Uh, but it's a very, very important, and it was found that what it is in here. It was not found in the jar. But it's a part of that new understanding of what was happening in the eastern part of the Roman Empire in the first 300 years of the Jesus movement. So, geography is important. The dynamics of geography are important. And the point that comes to me in an astounding kind of way is here were two very powerful and yet very different understandings of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. So even though we have the theology of the cross, there's also this other whole understanding of what Jesus meant, leading to full humanity. And that's a lot. I like that idea too, of the full humanity. Now you can go through Paul and you can find a lot of this stuff in Paul. It's not as straightforward as I'm making it here. I'm talking way beyond myself also. Uh, but anyway, that's a little bit of it. The uh, gospel geography, and Thomas and Mary. But this book is full of that. It is a lot of it is very difficult to read. It's in English, but the cosmology of it, the layers of gods and all of this stuff, but it's all Christian. It's just a very, 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 very different understanding of 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 Christianity. Part of this, about which I know almost nothing, that I know nothing about, is Eastern Orthodoxy, Russian, Armenian, Greek, and all of that, maintains uh, aspects of what Mary Magdalene and her crew did uh, in those first 3 centuries of the Jesus movement, which is always to say that there are many, many, many understandings of what it means to be a Jesus person. And it's not my job to tell you that yours is any better or worse than mine. Now, what you do with it is a big deal. Some of the stuff that goes under the name of Christianity today is not very good. For 300 years, the South maintained slavery theologically, biblically. So they didn't get it. They didn't get Jesus. They didn't get Paul. They didn't get Mary. They maintained slavery because it was economically feasible. So we do that constantly. Uh, if yours sounds different from mine, my quickest knee jerk is to say you don't count, not to say what you believe is valid. If you know, okay, but it's to say you don't count. I count, but you don't count. What you believe doesn't carry anything. You're a heretic, uh, and so I think we're constantly having to work on that, to look again at what we do here.